Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good. Well, Aaron, thanks for hopping on. Could you just give us a brief bio and some of the big themes and ideas you're interested in?
Yeah, so I have grown up in Bethesda, Maryland, next to Washington, D.C. my entire life. Right now, I'm a senior at Georgetown University. I'm majoring in economics and mathematics and minoring in philosophy. And I feel like I have a whole bunch of interests. So definitely interested in economics, politics and public policy across like a really wide range of areas, like everything from climate change, healthcare, science and technology policy, sort of like all of the above. Also really into effective altruism. I'm actually starting an effective altruism club at Georgetown University, which I'm super duper excited about, which is also going to be having its own podcast coming up shortly.
Awesome.
And besides that, also really like rock climbing. Been a competitive rock climber for a little while.
Super cool. Well, we'll plug your show in the show notes and everything. Make sure everybody has a link to it. That's
great.
That's super exciting. So Aaron, actually, I found your blog. You put I think a link on the Slate Star Codex Reddit page, and you're talking about the topic is not the content. And I really enjoyed this blog post. Essentially, you were talking about entering the workforce, and you've got this fresh perspective, right? Because you're about to graduate, you're an intern, and can you talk to that post a little bit? I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, so I have a sense that both for me and also for my peers, like we're in the process right now of like figuring out, a couple of years ago, like what to major in, what to study at college, right, which is really like the first time we get to like really choose what to study for many of us. And now we're up to like the point of literally applying for jobs and internships and sort of deciding what we kind of want to do with our lives. And one thing I think that's sort of intuitive is a way to go about this is to sort of ask yourself, like, what are you interested in? What are you like thinking about or talking about or discussing? And then maybe think about like what ways can you like apply that to your career? And I actually think this is a little bit misguided because based on sort of my very brief experience, a lot of times like what I've been calling like the topic. So like the topic area related to what sort of like a job or a college major is about isn't actually that closely related to like the minute to minute, hour to hour work and sort of like content. And for those who can't see me, I'm doing like air quotes, content of a job. And so my basic, I guess, recommendation is that we focus a little bit more on like the actual minute to minute activities of what we're sort of good at and enjoy doing rather than thinking more about like what sort of general, for lack of a better word, topics do we want to relate our sort of careers to.
Yeah, I thought this was super wise, and it's so often missed when people are thinking about choosing careers. It's what are you actually doing on the day to day, and do you enjoy that? And like what are the specific activities you're doing? I have a friend, he's an attorney. He clerked under Gorsuch. And and he talks about this a lot. This is what, and he's like, you really need to think about like there's the because you get a high status job where you just like what you're actually doing is just like incredibly boring or it doesn't align with your interest. But like the topic is on point. Like, oh yes, like I love constitutional law, but then when you're actually doing the gig, it's like, I don't know, maybe you're just sitting there writing briefs or reading briefs, and maybe you don't like reading briefs. And that would be pretty brutal. But I really like it because I think most people you're absolutely right. They completely miss this fact that probably the most important thing you should be looking at is what are you actually doing? Are you interested in that? Not like the broad topic of whatever like the field is.
Yeah. And I'll just like give you an example. So like take math. Like math has always sort of been my thing a little bit. Like for as long as I can remember. But like I find like sort of pure math just like super duper boring. Like But when I'm actually, so like, I would never read like a nonfiction book, like a popular sort of nonfiction book about
Yeah.
math, for example. I think I'd find that just like
It was
awful.
brutally
But
terrible.
yeah. But when I'm like actually like sort of in doing a proof, I can like get really into it and actually can find that like quite enjoyable. So yeah, I guess that just like goes to show how these two sort of things can kind of disconnect. Yeah.
That's cool. Are there any other observations you've seen being like fresh to the working world? Like you're at a really interesting place, right? I remember being there a couple years ago, where you're like you enter the workforce and you've got this like narrow view into it, but you've never been exposed to it, and like there's weird things going on. Is there anything else that you've noticed that it's like that's kind of something that people that are kind of immersed in it, they can't see they're like fish, they don't notice the water. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't want to make too many generalizations because I've been like a math tutor.
Right. So
I've worked
there,
at like
so
a
so
climbing gym, and right now I'm actually interning at the Department of the Interior. So like one thing that's been on my mind, maybe this is like a very general point, but it's just that like I think to outsiders things just like seem more arbitrary than they do to people who've been um, sort of like imbued in the work for a while. And so just like as an example, like something that we're doing at the Department of the Interior, they'll be like, one question is like, do you incorporate the social cost of greenhouse gases, like the externalities related to carbon,
yeah.
when you're like tallying up like what are the economic effects of X and Y policy? And like my initial thought was like, yeah, like obviously, like why would you not do this? But like that's not necessarily so obvious to the people who have been like sort of going about doing something one way or another this whole time. And I sort of would guess that this trend would hold true more generally, although I'm definitely not certain. So like I think just like maybe the value of just like asking sort of like the newbie in general, like what things don't seem so obvious, or like maybe do you think we should change, might be like a valuable way for like companies or organizations, the government, etc., to sort of like knock themselves out of that sort of like default way of doing things.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and perhaps this is why consultants make so much money, or else, or perhaps there's other reasons why. Uh, Many things going on there. Um, yeah, I think that's super well put. I had a thought. That was a good thought too. Oh well.
Oh no,
Um,
okay,
yeah, it's one of those things, right?
we can come back to it if you want.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, so you're interested in effective altruism. Um, And oh, I remember it now. Before we skip, I'll edit it. Magic of editing, and we'll fix that. But have you noticed? So the most shocking thing to me entering the workforce was have you heard of Cornell's iron law of bureaucracy?
I feel like maybe, but you're gonna have to remind me.
Okay, so it goes something like um over time, the people in the organization that are loyal to the organization's mission are crowded out by the people that whose primary goal is to like gain status within the organization and
Mm,
rise to the top. Um, and you see this with like older organizations, like, oh God, like no one's really trying to do the thing. They're all just trying to, somehow like bureaucratically navigate. And like, I don't know. I think that was the most surprising thing to me. Have you ever noticed anything like this, working and if you don't want to talk about it, that's completely fine. Cause I'm sure you're still in it. So, but have you noticed that working in the federal government?
yeah, so I would actually. It definitely sounds like a plausible theory. I would, if anything, I've been actually surprised at how it's like, at least in my very limited personal experience, it's like hasn't been super true. I mean, obviously, like I don't know a ton. Like I've been working at the DOI for a couple months, for example.
Yeah.
Um, but like everybody that I see, at least, like seems to be super duper like passionate about what they're actually
And
doing.
actually
Like
like
I
with the
know,
content, like they're
yeah,
actually like
yeah,
into it. That's cool.
totally, both the topic and the content, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, and both of my parents are government lawyers. This is a very
Yeah.
government family living in DC, and I know that like they're both they're quite successful, but they're definitely passionate about like really helping the American consumer, or
Yeah.
applying their creating like effective regulations. So I do think that as like a starting point, that's probably not a bad guess, but I wouldn't necessarily underestimate the effects of like having a strong culture of and like sort of just like social norms of people who like really want to be doing what they're doing, like that definitely like has a force to play as well. Like I wouldn't be overly cynical about bureaucracies.
Interesting. That's really interesting. That's cool. I like that. And Was your particular group, was it a newer group within DOI, or has it been
Uh,
around for a long time? Like,
I think it's been around for long enough to have them have changed their name.
oh wow,
So it's got to be a couple of years at least.
interesting. Well, that's good to hear. That's good. It's quite surprising. I just want, I wonder about this in the context of just coming out of this, this COVID world, right? And my favorite anecdote with about our response, through the federal government is the CDC in Atlanta. They're bringing it. There was a 60 Minutes piece a while back about they had a cruise ship. It's like maybe it was the Diamond Princess. I think it was another one. But they loaded up the passengers onto an airplane. Everyone is super sick with COVID. All these elderly people. People are falling over the flight. They land in Atlanta. It's where the CDC has their special unit deal with infections and pathogens that are coming to the country. Everyone gets out of the airplane and they walk into the airport and they kind of look at everybody and they just go, just go right ahead. People are like falling over, dying of COVID, and they walk into the busiest airport in the US.
Oh
So
my
I
god.
wonder like what is going on, right? And so perhaps it's just localized to certain parts of the federal government's apparatus, and it's just not.
Yeah, I'm no like expert on like the functionings of the federal government and bureaucracy, and like the US federal government is absolutely gigantic. So like
It's
I'm sure
huge.
there's
It's
a
a lot of
lot of
people.
different. Yeah. I think there is like a little bit of a conflict between what I was saying before about like sort of like defaults and precedents, like taking precedent for lack of a better word, and like the
Yeah.
people who like genuinely really care about their jobs. It's quite possible that like everybody who was involved in that decision, like if they were to like have been the person in power, like wouldn't have done that, but for one reason or another, like the protocols were just such that like the default thing to do was to like let them like go off the plane, and like there's
Right.
nobody like empowered enough to like really override that, which is like not to excuse like the system as a whole. Like I think that's absolutely terrible.
Right.
Yeah, but like maybe that goes a little ways toward explaining what was going on.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of the diffusion of responsibility. It's quite interesting. Um, Moving on a little bit, effective altruism. I know you're starting a club, so or you're in the club and you're starting a podcast around effective altruism through the club. So I know you're quite into to that topic. How'd you first get introduced to it? And you know, yeah, like let's start there. How'd you first get introduced to EA?
Yes, so as I said, I've been a competitive rock climber for a while. So back in high school, we had this event that me and my friends put on called the Mile Climb, where we tried to climb a vertical mile inside. So that's 132 40-foot routes over the course of a day. And this was a fundraiser. So for the first couple of years, we just chose like random charities based on what sounded good. But as one of the organizers, at one point I came across GiveWell, and most of your audience probably knows what that is, but just
Yeah.
briefly, they like evaluate charities for like how much they can do to like help people, especially in the developing world, for example, by preventing malaria. And they're like an integral sort of part of the effective altruism movement. And from there, I just started like learning more about it and was like pretty quickly sort of convinced that this is like a good way of like framing, how to use your career, how to use your money to help people. So yeah, that's how I found out about it.
Nice. That's cool. That's cool. And I think it's super important just to like that, there's objections to it. Absolutely. Effective altruism, utilitarianism in general. But I think generally we should try to give to charities that, at least spend the money on the thing they're trying to do and try and think about what causes are more effective than others. I think it's a very good thing to do in general. And something a lot of people miss. There's like the feel good aspect of charity, and that kind of I think that overrides generally how people think about what to give to.
Yeah.
Um, Absolutely. So you wrote another piece, and it was about how we treat children. Can you frame that a little bit? I thought it was a really good piece. Um, yeah.
Yeah, of course. So my piece was basically about how we as a society, sort of adults in general, at least in the United States, I don't want to speak for the whole world, just like don't treat children super well. And by that I mean like we kind of do what I call like casual disrespect, like quite often. So I start with this opening example of how when I was a summer camp counselor, I remember that like all the counselors would sort of like lie to the kids, the campers, about their age all the time. Even though like I couldn't think of like a plausibly like compelling reason to do this. like these were just like normal, 9 to 15-year-olds or whatever,
Yeah.
and they wanted to know like basic biographical information about like, their counselors. And they would ask, how old are you? But for some reason, like there was just like a norm around like not saying your age. And I don't think it was ever like an official rule. And just as a little bit more context, like there's obviously things that you shouldn't tell, like
Right.
that should topics that should be off limits for discussion. I completely agree with that. But like, why did we have to lie so much,
Right.
And so I think if I recall correctly, I was like one of the few counselors that just started sort of telling them, like, yeah, I'm 16 years old. And part of this was because I looked like I was 13 or something at the time.
Right.
So like I wanted them to know that I was like, in fact, older than them. But then, yeah, so I think it sort of holds true more generally. Like, it's not that we should treat kids identically to adults. Like, there are real substantive differences between kids and adults. I mean, especially kids of, younger ages. But the fact of their youth or their age alone it shouldn't be a sufficient reason to treat them differently. So, like in general, if there's not a compelling reason to tell a lie, or maybe a less loaded term is to say a untrue statement or something like that, then in general, just like our rule of thumb should be, we shouldn't do that. Also, things like kind of like baby talking. Like I think it's like very tempting, sort of like natural, even if there's a kid like 8 or 10 years old who's like not like an infant, to like talk to them in sort of like a weird mannerism. And it's kind of like, why do we do that? I think we're just basically conveying, like you don't really deserve to be treated like a real sort of normal human being. And I sort of do remember throughout my childhood wondering, why why am I being treated so differently? Like it's not like, is there any some like magical thing that happens when I turn like 18 or 20? And I can tell you, like I'm 21 now, like no, like there's nothing magical that happens when you turn 18 or 20 that like makes you officially an adult. So that's like the basic story.
Yeah, I think that's it's quite wise to notice that. Um, I was at a party. My wife, she or she used to work in a psychology lab here at the University of North Carolina, and they had a party with the psychology department, and I went, and they had a psychologist there from Duke, and he's a big researcher in developmental psychology. And so I asked him, like, what do you understand about your field? I love this question. What do you understand about your field that lay people just like everyone in your field knows, but lay people just like don't understand or would be surprised by. And you find out some really interesting things. Anyway, he mentioned like the biggest thing is kids, they understand a ton of things, a lot more than we give them credit for. And so like treating them like they're just like this other like and like you said, of course, like there's special cases where there's topics should be off limits. But when you're talking to them, they you should not try to like I don't know, it's like really it's a bizarre thing. Why do you think we treat them differently, like they don't like almost like they're fools in some sense?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and one thing, it just like, so I was thinking back to like, what was the experience of being, say, like 6, 10, 14, whatever, like, versus like, how did I come across? And like, when I like read something that I wrote when I was like 8, like, it just like obviously sounds like way less like mature, like
Right.
just like way less like coherent or whatever. So like, maybe it's that kids are just like much worse at like communicating and expressing their ideas than they are at actually like having their ideas, kind of. So if there's like an 8-year-old and he's like messing up the grammar, he's like not conjugating verbs like correctly, like I think it's tempting to maybe assume that kind of like translates over into like the actual sort of like contents of his thought, for like lack of a better term.
Right.
Whereas maybe it just doesn't, like maybe it's just that like kids are still learning like language. It takes a while to be good at like eloquent writing, but like that doesn't necessarily reflect sort of what's going on underneath the surface. Like we should probably give them a little bit more credit for like the fundamental sort of like integrity and maturity of their ideas.
Yeah, I think it's a yeah, it's a thing where it would make sense that obviously they're not as good as at communicating their ideas, because it takes a while to even get your own theory of mind for other people and understand and empathize with them. So transmitting ideas properly and in a good way, it takes some time to get there. So perhaps it's just this fallacy and trap adults fall into all the time. Um,
Mm.
where we just think they're all just like they're just completely stupid and don't understand anything yet. Um,
And one more little thing I'll mention is that in this piece I do cite this like Atlantic article. I forget what it's called, but basically about how this is not a human universal. Like there are other cultures that basically treat kids, not obviously they don't treat like 2-year-olds like they're 20-year-olds. Like
right.
there's real differences there. but like basically just treat them a lot more normally. Like no excessive. One thing I call out is like excessive praise that like kids can obviously see through. I remember for one, like when I was like in like little league baseball, like being constantly complimented and like knowing that it was BS. And so like I'm sure I'm not like the only kid who realized that. So like there's other cultures that like don't do this like constant praise, basically like don't like constantly throw like modified forms of attention on kids. So it's not something that like has to be, you know, we as a culture, I think could sort of move in the right direction.
Yeah. And I think it's important to do so. You know, a lot of my wife's research has been in, you know, like the language you use, the metacognitive language you use and teachers use, and how that's important and people develop their thinking. And if you completely just, you know, talk to someone like they're stupid, you know, it's like maybe in some sense it's self-perpetuating. I don't know enough about it, but it seems like it would be a good idea to avoid some of
Mm.
that. So I'm curious, you're interested in drugs and psychopharmacology, is that correct?
Yeah. One of my like disparate interests. That's right.
Nice. Have you ever heard of zolpidem, zolpidem, excuse my pronunciation, but the ambient effect? This is an aside, but you've heard of
The
the ambient
ambient
effect?
effect. I feel like I've heard the ambient effect, like that phrase used, but once again, you're gonna have to remind me.
Okay, you should check this out. I think you'll like this. So, if you give certain TBI patients, like so people that have suffered traumatic brain injuries, and you know they can't talk, or there's like you know severe cognitive impairment. Sometimes if you give them Ambien, you know for about 30 minutes, they'll regain a lot of function. So you know they'll be able to talk and things like that. Anyway, there's like all these weird things with the brain. That's what I'm trying to the general sense I'm trying
That's
to give. But
fascinating.
it's
Yeah.
really interesting, right? All these weird effects. So how did you originally get interested? Was there like one moment, or it's just like this is an interesting topic? Don't really know where it came from.
Um, I mean, I wouldn't say a single moment, but like one thing, it just like I had a family member who was struggling with an illness that they really did their research and thought that they needed their particular medication. And I've talked with this person; they're okay with me mentioning that in the abstract. And um, and they sort of were up against. So they really did their research basically into like the effects of this medication and sort of what types of effects it was going to have on their brain, etc.
Yeah.
And they really ran up against some issues like getting it prescribed. Like they couldn't really convince anyone to prescribe it. And so this got me really interested both in like sort of medicine and as an institution kind of, and then
Yeah.
also just psychopharmacology in general. It was like a mental health medication um, and just also sort of from a different lens. I just sort of intrinsically find it fascinating how you know drink a cup of coffee and you like feel a little bit different, you know. Not that since I've just turned 21 I can say, you know, have a sip of beer and feel a little bit different.
Right.
And you know this is sort of like the raw experience of life, like basically like the way that we sort of conceptualize the world and feel is like controlled by like tiny little chemicals sort of coursing through our brains. I just sort of intrinsically find that very interesting.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. And even just, you know, I think it was probably 4 months ago, you know, I made a big pot of coffee, and you know, I was working on some like tasks that required me to really focus, and I ended up drinking, you know, like the entire pot over like a couple hours. And like, man, like I feel like distinctly different. And like I feel like this, and I drank so much caffeine, you know, I've got some euphoria going on, right? And I was like, man, like it's incredible how chemical like our experience is, right? Like, you know, how weird it is that you can modify that. Like it doesn't, I don't know that perhaps that's just like a banal assumption, but it's like a banal thought. But I find that really interesting. Are there, you know, you mentioned not being able to, you know, this person, you know, they read all the literature, determined that this drug would be beneficial or something like that. They try to get it prescribed, can't convince anybody to do it.
Hmm.
Do you think we should have more lax laws around prescription drugs in the U.S.?
Yeah, I do. So first of all, I'll just say like I'm not an absolutist in this sense. Like there are definitely people who would say that like the government has absolutely no business regulating, you know, what people put
Right.
in their bodies. And I think that there certainly are certain substances that have like sufficient sort of externalities, like that would like, you know, cause people to be very violent or do other things that would like impose burdens on like the rest of society that would warrant sort of government control.
Yeah.
But just from a practical standpoint, like there's a lot of just like normal prescription drugs that I don't think the government should basically forbid people from taking, either entirely or until they get doctors' approval. And before everybody sort of jumps on this as like very naive, I would which maybe it is, to be fair. We have to think about like how we're doing right now. So there's like a bunch of research that shows that like a lot of FDA approved drugs just like aren't very effective. There's like all this like statistical like malfeasance that goes on, like p hacking and stuff by like pharmaceutical companies. I think there's some studies that like cancer drugs like either don't extend life or extend life by an average of like 7 days or something like that, after paying like $50,000.
Yeah.
So like relative to that, like should we be preventing patients who like have done their research, who think that like this is like X, Y, and Z, X, Y, or Z is something that could really improve their lives, from taking the substance? And I think the answer is no, mostly out of just sort of a basic concern for like autonomy and justice, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, I think it's super important. Yeah, and I agree, like fentanyl, maybe it should, that should probably be illegal. We should probably regulate that. But there's a whole class of things that we have that we just disallow, and it also drives the price up, right? Which makes things worse. I remember, recently my dog got sick and he got some medication prescribed. There's an issue with the prescription. It took like 3 weeks to get the medication because of the issue with the prescription. And that's USDA, it's not even FDA, but I couldn't walk in the store and just buy it. It's sitting there and no one will give it to me. And it's like, this is for a dog. This is not like, there's no way you can abuse this. It's like, it's just like some regulation, like creep or something that's caused this to be, or just the pharmacy lobby. I'm not sure which. But so I guess I'm curious. You've written a couple of posts about different drugs and like whether or not they should have been approved, like whether or not they work. Do any of those stand out as like really interesting cases?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just mention the one that I wrote recently about, which is aducanumab. So you guys, like, it's an obscure name, but like this is the controversial Alzheimer's drug. Like if you Google like controversial Alzheimer's drug, it'll pop up with like a trillion articles.
Nice.
And this is like, so the basics background is like a drug for Alzheimer's. Basically, my impression is that it showed very little efficacy unless you look at a very specific subpopulation of patients, and the FDA approved it anyway. Actually, recently they backtracked on that, so I don't actually know what the official status is right now. But at first glance, I was like, wow, like this is pretty bad. This is like industry pressure, winning. I mean, and also a little bit more sympathetically, patients, like Alzheimer's advocacy groups, I think were pushing for it as well, which is very understandable. There are millions of people who are sort of pinning their hopes on this like one drug, because I know there've been a lot of attempts to develop Alzheimer's drugs and without very much success. And so my sense was like, wow, like this is like basically government not working,
right.
Pressure groups like affecting regulation. But then after thinking about it, I was like, well, actually, no, like the FDA, even though the FDA shouldn't have put their mark on it as safe and effective, like they were right not to block people from taking it. Like it should be, some people have different risk tolerances, and Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. And and it's almost certainly not an abusable drug, like from a recreational standpoint. So basically, like it should be up to patients and their doctors to decide whether to take it. And the FDA was basically right not to stand in their way in that sense. And the other thing I'll mention here is that I do think that removing sort of the mandatory FDA approval. So in sort of my dream world, let me take a step back for a second. In my dream world, the FDA would still like review drugs. They would still demand randomized clinical trials from drug companies. But they wouldn't be in the business of, once they receive those clinical trials, the data, et cetera, blocking them from being sold. So I do think that the current system of where the FDA basically approves a drug as safe and effective kind of takes the pressure inappropriately off of like medicine and individual doctors to like critically evaluate the evidence. So like right now, like no one is, if you have a patient that's diagnosed with like X and there's a drug that's approved for X, I'm sort of guessing that a lot of times, like the doctor maybe isn't under a huge amount of pressure to like critically evaluate whether X is in fact right for the patient. And so I do think that removing this sort of barrier might, in a good way, like put a little bit more pressure back on both like doctor and institutional medicine and patient alike to like on an individual basis, sort of like clarify whether whether we think this is a good cost benefit analysis worth taking. So I do think that's maybe an unexpected effect that this might have. But again, this is just speculation.
Got it. And I definitely think, I'm definitely with you. I think I wonder if it would be wise just to lean into safety, like FDA, like, why don't you just focus on safety and efficacy? Like, just cut that out and maybe demand RCTs, but like not could make the decision from there. It's yeah, I don't know. It is interesting when you read like that post you put up, like it's like, wow, you know, what drugs do we have that actually work? You know what I mean? Like it's it's a
Yeah.
short list, antibiotics, they work. They're great.
Vaccines, luckily.
Yeah, vaccines, like short list. Um Prison sentences.
Right.
I tend to think I want to talk about the post a little bit. Do you think it's more important to it does seem to me consistency of punishment is much more important than like severity. And we
Yeah.
probably worry too much about severity and like cranking it up so you appear tough. What do you think about that? What do you think about prison sentencing here in the US?
Yeah, so I have sort of two distinct views. Like one is like in total agreement, consistency, just like both from like an intuitional perspective and
Right.
like empirically, like I've like looked into it like a little bit. Consistency is just like much better at deterring crime. So like if I mean just imagine that you were 100% sure that if you were to steal a bike, you were going to go to jail. Like no one would steal a bike, or like
Yeah.
basically nobody would steal a bike.
Yep.
And obviously we can't get to 100%. But right now, like the US in general is actually like shockingly bad at like finding criminals. And like this sort of I don't think necessarily accords with like some popular images of the US as being like really tough on crime, and like inhumanely so, which I definitely think it is in some ways. But like I do think that we should call out the fact that like many, I think except for murder, like a huge number of crimes go unsolved. And just like empirically, this is really the thing that we could change to reduce crime. Because, whatever you think about criminal justice issues, et cetera, nobody in general, crimes are in fact a bad thing. Like we would want less
Crimes are
of them,
bad.
not more in
Yeah.
general. And um, and yeah, and so making sure that people sort of know, like have a higher confidence that if they do something that harms other people, that something bad's going to happen, hopefully not, life ruining or awful. That definitely almost certainly would really reduce crime. And the second thing, which I know gets to the piece that you were mentioning, is even like putting that aside, I do I do think that prison sentences sort of as a whole are too long. And I have a sort of technocratic brain for a lot of these posts that I write, but like this one really came out of just like thinking about like, wow, so like I hear all the time, not all the time, but like occasionally I'll hear, John goes to prison for 20 years, Derek goes to prison for 10 years or 5 years or even 1 year. Like, wait a second, like those are just like incredibly long periods of time.
Yeah.
Like 10 years, like that's when I was like 11 years old. Like that seems like just like it's up like literally almost half my life. Like that's just
Yeah.
like a huge amount of time. Like how sure are we that like that's actually the appropriate type of sentence? And like especially in the context that like prison sentencing just empirically doesn't do much for deterring crime, and consistency is much more important. It just like as a whole, I just do think that prison sentences in general should be shifted shorter. So I'd love to hear what you think about that and whether this is just like again one like very naive.
Yeah, no, it makes ton of sense. And I also wonder, like I think people could tell the difference between 1 year and like going, life in prison. But like, like when you're conceptualizing of how bad something will be, like the difference between 5 and 10 years, like I don't feel like, this enters in the calculus really, right? Like,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and so I wonder if that's just this big argument for just, reducing sentences in general. It'd be a lot cheaper as well, all kinds of things. You mentioned something I think that's interesting. Do you get the sense that America is simultaneously like over policed and under policed in the sense that, we have a lot less cops on the beat than other countries do. um, and it's a much more, it feels much more adversarial,
Mm.
and it's almost random. Like when the cops are there, it gets violent a lot more. Like there are a lot of violent incidents involving police that don't involve killings. It's like they're beating a lot of people up, and that's really bad too. Um, do you get the sense that we could do better if we just had more cops? Perhaps compensate them better, and actually encourage them to get out in the community more.
Yeah, so this is probably gonna be a little bit of an unpopular opinion in maybe some of my circles, but yeah, I'm in total agreement with that. If you just like, my impression of the literature is literally just having cops like stand on corners, just like looking around, doing absolutely nothing, is like very effective at preventing crime because like people don't steal bikes when there's like a cop right there.
Right.
And then also there's like surveys that show that even people who like really think that like police violence and aggressiveness is like a serious issue often do in fact want more police in their communities. So I do think that there's a lot of potential literally for just having, if there's a way to make police, interact more appropriately and be more well accepted by their communities. I do think there's a lot to be gained by literally having like cops literally just as like as eyes, sort of just like standing around in neighborhoods, like preventing crime that way, because it's like a remarkably effective how effective that is. But all that said, I don't at all want to discount like the very real issues of police brutality. I don't want to make any sort of like statistical claims or anything, but my general sense is that despite having fewer cops on the beat, as you said, as other countries, there's a little bit of a culture of as you said, an adversarial relationship between the police and the communities they're supposed to be protecting. And there's been a lot of ink spilled on this topic. I'm not going to be the one to
Yeah.
like solve it, unfortunately. But I think you're absolutely right that like we're sort of, there's no like one unidirectional way of fixing like the police issue in America. Like things have to sort of go in both directions a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember, Tyler Cowan. Tyler Cowan.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, conversations with Tyler. He had some lady on from the University of Virginia, and I hate to call her out, but she's one of these. She's like really important police scholar. She's like one of the most cited, people. And he kept asking her, like, what policy prescriptions do you have? And she's like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And to a certain extent, I do understand. Like, you don't want to like proclaim something if you're not sure. But what I worry about is if all the scholars that know everything are like, we don't know, we're not going to make any policy prescriptions. Then who's going to make the policy prescriptions? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, how do we go anywhere then if you aren't going to have any ideas, right? Like you have to have some idea. If you are the best, you have to have some idea in some sense, but you just like don't want to commit. I don't know. It's a weird field, but it's something very important to work on.
Mm.
I hate to stick on police, but one thing I've noticed is a weird thing about the police is it's super politically polarized in the sense that 90+% of cops are red tribe in this country,
Yeah.
and it's, I wonder if it's kind of the same thing with police unions where 90+% of the teachers they're blue tribe, and you get all these weird things going on when like it's just like ultra concentrated on one side of the political spectrum. Do you think that plays into it at all?
Yeah, I do. This gets a little bit back to what I was saying about just like culture in different parts of the government. I think that actually can have a really strong effect. I haven't done like a recent like literature review on this, but I think a little bit based on what I've like read, and then also just sort of introspecting as to what it would be like to be a cop, in a place, yeah, like amid say 90% fellow Trump supporters, for example, and what that would be like relative to like I imagine like my peers at Georgetown all like turning into the police force and like what that would be like. And I just have a
Right.
sense that those would be very different experiences. I don't know how tractable this issue is though. Like how do we change that? If
Right.
it's a thing to be
So
changed, I really don't know.
yeah. I think this is politically infeasible, but I think if you doubled salaries for police officers, you'd get a very different kind of like, because like, I don't know. Like I think about all my peers that went to this like, you know, flagship state university, and like none of them are ever going to become a police officer. It's just like not going
Yeah.
to happen. You know what I mean? Like, and I wonder about weird effects like that where, you just select for these certain, you're selecting for something. And then once it gets, above a certain percentage of a certain type of people in there, they're selecting for themselves, and there's, it keeps spiraling up.
I think
But
it's
it's
true for. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I think it's true for like civil servants to a large extent in general. It's just like there are people who like I mean, police is like one issue where one sort of career that is particularly like polarized in politically, but like even other things that maybe don't have that as much. Like I know teachers are pretty diverse politically. Like the relatively low salaries in many parts of the country just contribute to people sort of having to choose between taking a career that could pay them significantly more and doing something they want to do that's like very much pro-social. And like this is just not a choice we should be forcing on,
Right.
at least in my opinion, onto people. We could, public defenders as well. I think in general it would be a good use of our tax dollars to increase the salaries of many such categories of public servant.
Yeah, I think so. And even to the extent of, if you have to make a trade-off with a certain amount of money, it's like less highly paid, having less people that are more highly paid, maybe better trade-off in some cases.
Hmm.
I'm curious, how does this do issues like this play into, you're senior, getting ready to graduate. I'm sure you're thinking about career a lot, you've been writing on it. Um, how does this play into how you think about building a career? And have you thought about that very much?
Yeah. Yes. This is very salient for me right now. I need to give more thought to it because unlike some of my peers, I don't have as much of a plan, I think, as I really should. So I mean, I think I'm very fortunate for being in a position where I probably do have some options. I'm extremely fortunate for being able to go to Georgetown University, for example, and um, I don't think I have anything super insightful to say on this matter, except that unfortunately, like for better or worse, there is a trade off in certain respects between doing something that might seem more intrinsically interesting versus altruistic,
Right.
versus remunerative. I think is the right word.
Yeah.
And to some extent, this is in fact functional. Like, this is how the economy works. Like there are some things that are less pleasant, and so we pay people more to do them.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
that's not necessarily a bad
The way
thing,
it goes.
but like sometimes there can be like kind of a failure, I think, where there might be people like me who might do things that are a little bit more on like the investment banky side of things, and not for earning to give necessarily, so they don't just want to donate their money,
Right.
instead of doing something that might be like more socially valuable and meaningful to them as well.
That's yeah. It's a real trade off. I'm curious. I'm sure you're aware of the $80,000, 80,000 hours career recommendations.
Mm.
Have you found that valuable? And
Oh, tremendously. I think they're just, we'll just say 80,000hours.org is just probably the single best resource, at least that I've found, for just thinking about
nice.
career planning in general. I mean, they are explicitly an effective altruism organization,
Yeah.
but even if you're not interested in that, a ton of their resources are just like about, you know, everything from, interviewing and, how to plan a career and, plan Bs and stuff like that. It's just incredibly valuable. And, my personal take, I think, is that like I do sort of agree with them in general that you should probably start with like what are the if you do want to make sort of a positive impact on the world,
Yeah.
you should really start with like what are the biggest problems in the world, and then like how can you use your skills to
Right.
solve them, instead of thinking, like how can I apply what I happen to want to do in some way
Yeah.
that also happens to be beneficial.
Right.
So yeah, I'm in very much agreement with them, I think.
That's cool. That's cool. Um, let's see. You ready for overrated, underrated?
Oh, of course.
All right. So overrated or underrated? We've talked about it a little bit, but the FDA, or excuse me, FDA, overrated,
Uh,
underrated.
yeah, overrated. Yeah, so they're not doing a huge job of approving drugs that actually work, and they're also sometimes like with the COVID vaccines, I'd like failing to approve drugs that, or not letting people take drugs that would be like potentially life saving. And I'm not sure how widespread this knowledge is in like American society, so overrated.
Nice. The Washington D.C. metro area, overrated or underrated?
Um, Yeah, I'm really not the best person to ask because I've lived here my whole life. So like I don't feel like I
Just like
have
in the
enough
water,
of a yeah, I'm not like I need like an outside perspective.
the
I
outside
guess
view.
I would yeah. Probably appropriately rated on average, maybe underrated by like well, okay, sorry, I'm gonna do a little tangent here. So I would say from the government side, Congress probably overrated. Nothing ever happens. We need to abolish the filibuster. Bureaucracy probably underrated. That's where like a lot of like the rules decisions get made. Yeah, so that's one thing. You know, there's some aggressive drivers. 270s, maybe not in this place, but probably appropriately rated on average.
Nice. Like it. The book Subtract, overrated, underrated?
So I actually last time I checked, it had 4 stars on Amazon. So it's not not just good or bad, but overrated, underrated. So I'd say this is overrated. I read the book. It was when I read it, it was only published a few months. I only read it a few months after it was published, and it basically makes the case that sort of humans in general like systematically neglect subtraction as like a way of making change. And part of it comes from like this author's like individual research, but then he sort of tries to connect it to like broader society and adding in historical anecdotes and evidence. And I really thought the first part was pretty good. Like he does sort of make the case that like at least in the lab, like the not just in the lab actually, like at the individual level at least, humans really do systematically neglect subtracting. It can be anything from like trying to improve a golf course, like people will add elements instead of subtract them, like even when you remind people that they're able to subtract, and like a huge number of sort of dimensions and topics. So he did make that case pretty convincingly, but everything else was just a little bit weaker. Yeah.
Gotcha. That makes sense. It's quite interesting. Minimum wage laws, overrated, underrated?
Oh, yeah, overrated, way overrated. I definitely am on the at least economically progressive side of things. But I think that of all the ways to like basically help poor and middle income people, this is not a particularly good way. Basically, because even though there's plenty of research that right now, like the $7.25 to $15 minimum wages don't have a huge negative effect on employment, like we know basically for a fact, just from like common sense, that at some point, like it would have an effect on employment. So then the question becomes like, how far can we push it before people start being unemployed? But like, this is not a trade-off that we have to make. Like if you just have like a negative income tax, which basically means giving money to people with low incomes, literally a negative tax, unemployment insurance, things like that, universal basic income. If we're just giving people money, like we don't have to worry that we're going to be like secretly harming them by giving them money. Like there can be negative effects from this, but it's not going to be harming like the very people that we're directly helping. But like on the opposite side, like you could imagine a situation where we do like a $25 minimum wage, and some people do in fact who would otherwise be hired, cannot find a job because of this. And in this case, we are like harming the direct people we're trying to help. And so because of this, I just don't think it's a particularly good way of sort of like helping low and middle income people.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Aaron, thanks for coming on. Do you have any final thoughts, and where can people find your blog, your Substack?
Oh yeah. Final thoughts. Well, first of all, I don't think so. Just thank you so much. This was a blast. Had a lot of fun doing this. And my blog, I think the official name is Aaron's blog, very creative, and that's
nice.
aaronbergman.substack.com. And hopefully we'll have my EA group's podcast feed up in the near future. So maybe we'll stick that in the show notes. But yeah, again, thank you so much.
Definitely. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives.